Chapter 13. One morning in November, when Randy was breakfasting early and alone, Dan Gunn came downstairs smooth-shaven, his jaw looking oddly pallid in contrast to his brown forehead, nose, cheekbones, and neck. "Good morning, Randy," he said. "You swore you'd never shave again. Why?" "Well," Dan said lamely, "I had the razor, and it seemed a shame not to put it to use after Peyton gave it to me. Then there was the soap." Within the past few weeks, bars of homemade soap had appeared in Marines Park, produced by Mrs. Estes, who had been senior teller at the bank, and two former co-workers. Everyone agreed that it would be a prosperous and rewarding business. "The truth, Dan," Randy said. "Helen asked me to do it. She said she was getting tired of trimming it." "Oh, that's different. You'd better get home in time for dinner tonight. John Garcia made another run up to Blue Crab Pool, and he's dropping off a wash tub of crabs here, in exchange for 1 quart of lightning." Dan said, "I'm very fond of Helen. I don't know what I'd do without her." "Why do anything without her?" "Randy, I want to marry her." Randy rose from the table, bowed, and said, "I give you my blessing." "It isn't funny. Marriage is rarely funny." "She won't marry me." "Then why did you shave off your beard?" "Damn it, Randy, I love her. And she loves me. She admitted it. She wants to marry me, but she won't. She thinks that there's a chance Mark's still alive. She's afraid that if we married, then Mark would turn up alive and there'd be one of those awful messes we've all heard about or read about. Like when men were reported dead in the Philippines or Korea and they turned up after the war in an enemy prison camp. They came home and found their wives happily married to someone else. Sometimes there were children. It's always a mess." "It's happened," Randy said. "But in this case, I don't think there's a chance. Want me to talk to her?" Dan rubbed his face where his beard had been. "I feel naked." "No, Randy, thanks. I don't think Helen would want it discussed. Not yet, anyway. She just has this feeling, and I'm afraid she'll have to empty it herself." It was in this month that the first low-flying plane frightened and exhilarated them. At irregular times, planes had been reported before, but always jets, flying very high, usually no more than a silver splinter in the sky, or a contrail in a day, and only sound at night. But in the second week in November, a big 4-engine transport roared over Fort Repose at 1,000 feet. It bore Air Force markings. In Marines Park, everyone screamed and waved. It did not even waggle its wings, but went on south. Dan Gunn, who was in town, saw it directly overhead. Randy heard and saw it from River Road. The admiral, who was out on the river in his flagship, was able to observe it through binoculars. That night, Randy and Lib and Dan and Helen went to Sam Hazard's house to hear his opinion. "I noticed 2 cylinders slung under the wing," he said. "Not extra gas tanks. I think they might be air traps. I think they might be taking radiation samples." A week later, the same plane, or one like it, came over again. This time it circled Fort Repose, and a stream of what appeared to be confetti at the distance fell from its belly and drifted down on the riverbanks and in the town. Randy was in Marines Park at the time, discussing an alarm system with officers of his company. Church bells had been used in England during the Second World War, and there were bells in the Catholic and Episcopal churches. It was possible to evolve a code by which his troopers could understand the type and location of the emergency. The plane came over and everyone yelled, as before, as if they could hear them. Then the leaflets fluttered down. They read, "Do not be alarmed. This leaflet comes from a United States Air Force plane conducting atmospheric surveys of the contaminated zones. At a future date, a more precise survey will be undertaken by helicopters. Should a helicopter land in or near your community, do not interfere with the activities of personnel aboard. Lend them your cooperation if requested. This activity is an essential preliminary to bringing relief to the contaminated zones." In a sense, it was disappointing, but it was something. It was something you could put your hands on, that you could feel, and that had come from the outside. It was proof that the government of the United States still functioned. It was also useful as toilet paper. Next day, 10 leaflets would buy an egg and 50 a chicken. It was paper, and it was money. In December, the helicopter came. It made a fearful racket, windmilling over Fort Repose. At various open spaces, including Marines Park, it hovered low and dropped a long wire from its belly, a small cylinder on the end of the wire actually touching the earth. It was like a gigantic bug dipping for honey. It came up the Timucuan and circled the Bragg house. The children were down at the dock. Helen and Lib were in the house. Randy was visiting with Sam Hazard. It circled 4 times. The 2 women ran up to the captain's walk. They had the best view. They waved their arms, and Helen took off her pink apron and waved that. Inside the helicopter, they saw faces, and the pilot opened a window and waved back. Then it went away up the Timucuan. In 5 minutes, Randy, the Admiral, and the children, all out of breath, were at the house. Helen was weeping. "He waved," she said. "He waved at us. Nobody else. Us. I'm sure he came just to see me." "Now let's not get too excited," Randy said. "It may be that he was looking for people, not anyone in particular, and saw the kids out on the dock and then circled the house to encourage us and give us heart." Helen wiped her face with her apron. She said, "Oh, I wish he'd come back. Please, God, send him back." At that moment, they heard it coming back. The children ran up to the roof. Randy went outside and sat on the porch steps. He was still out of breath, and he wasn't going to run upstairs. If the damn helicopter wanted to see him, it would have to come here. He couldn't go to it. Sam Hazard sat down beside him. Randy watched for it. From the sound, he knew it was circling again. It came low over the trees and hovered over the lawn. Everything else was overgrown and choked with weeds and sprouting saplings, but this single stretch between house and road Randy kept in lawn. It was one of Ben Franklin's chores to mow once a week, and it was a link between the house and the time before the day, like shaving. It hovered there and slowly lowered. Randy said, "It's coming in." He rose to receive it. Its wheels touched the ground, its engines cut off, and the rotors drooped and slowed. Peyton ran down the steps, and Randy grabbed her. "Don't go out there until the rotors stop," he ordered. "Cut your head off." Now that it was down, the helicopter looked ungainly and enormous. There were 5 men in it. They waited in stillness so complete that they heard the creak of hinges and the hatch opened. A metal ladder fell from the side, and 2 men climbed down. Plastic helmets covered their heads, and they were encased in silver, translucent plastic suits, oxygen tanks strapped to their backs. Like divers, Randy thought, or maybe spacemen. Peyton and Ben Franklin had run out on the lawn. Now they shrank back. One of the men, laughing silently in his helmet, held up his hand in a gesture. "Wait." The 2 men carried machines that looked like miniature vacuum cleaners, a cylindrical nozzle in one hand, an oblong black box in the other. They allowed these nozzles to sniff at grass and earth. Geiger counters, Sam Hazard said, maybe were hot. One of the men approached them, hesitated, and selected Randy. He bent over and allowed the nozzle to sniff Randy's last pair of boat shoes, big toe protruding through the canvas, soles reinforced with possum hide. The nozzle investigated the tattered shorts, the belt, and finally, Randy's hair. At each point, the head in the helmet glanced at the dial in the box. It was very efficient. The man swept off his helmet, slammed his hand on Randy's shoulder as if in congratulations, and called back to the helicopter, "Okay, Colonel, the terrain's clear and they're clear. You can come down." His back toward them, a man climbed down. He wore a blue zippered Air Force flight suit with the eagles of full colonel on his shoulders. When he turned and stepped forward, Randy did not immediately recognize him. He was so changed. It was not until the man held out his hand and spoke that Randy knew it was Paul Hart, who had been a light colonel, a sandy-haired instead of gray, his face cheery and freckled instead of lined and aged when he saw him last. Randy could think of nothing to say except, "Come on in, Paul, and bring your people. We're just about to sit down for lunch." Lib cried, "The quail!" and dashed into the house, letting the screen door bang. "My wife," Randy said. "It's her lunch day." "Your wife? Congratulations, my wife." "I'll save it for later." Randy saw that the men with the Geiger counters had stripped off their plastic suits. "You'll all have a drink before lunch," he suggested, thinking that this had been the proper thing to do, a long time ago, and would still be proper and expected. "Why, I'd be delighted," Paul said. "I haven't had a drink since—" He asked a question. "You people haven't saved your liquor all this time, have you?" "Oh, no, this stuff is new. Well, it's aged a bit, in a charcoal keg. We think it's very good." He led them up to his apartment and mixed sours with the corn whiskey and fat, ripe limes. Then there were introductions. There was a Captain Bayless, the pilot, Lieutenant Smith, chief radiologist, and 2 sergeant technicians. They all considered the sour very good, and Paul said it's impossible to find anything to drink, even in Denver, not even beer. Shortage of grains, you know. Nobody would dare make his own whiskey in the clear zones. He'd go to jail. The older people say it's worse than prohibition. There were 1,000 questions Randy wanted to ask, but at that moment he only had time for one, because Lib called from downstairs. Lunch was ready. The men all wore brassards with the letters D.C. on the right arms. "What's that?" Randy asked, touching Paul's brassard. "District of Columbia?" "Oh, no," Paul said. "There isn't any District of Columbia. Denver's the capital. That stands for Decontamination Command. It's the biggest command nowadays, and really the only one that counts. I was seconded to the D.C. last spring. I put in for a CZ right away and asked for Florida, and Florida was the CZ I got." Paul Hart thought the soup was wonderful and said he had never tasted anything exactly like it before, and Randy replied that he wasn't surprised. They always kept the big soup pot simmering on the fire and everything went into it. "This particular soup," he explained, "is sort of a combination: armadillo, gopher, and turkey carcass." Lib brought a dozen quail, and more were broiling, and placed pitchers of orange juice in front of them, and they all drank it greedily. Captain Bayless kept mumbling that he felt they were imposing, and that there were K-rations in the helicopter, and that he actually expected to find CZ people all starving, because certainly most of them were in other parts of the country. He also kept on eating. "How does it happen," Randy asked Hart, "that you found us?" Hart said, "You haven't heard anything from my wife, Martha, have you?" Randy shook his head no, apprehending Paul's tragedy. "Of course, that's why I asked for duty in this CZ. I wanted to find out what happened to Martha and the children." He looked up. "It was just a year ago, wasn't it, that I met you at McCoy Operations? Wasn't it on the day before H-Day?" "H-Day? We just call it the day. Hell Day or Hydrogen Day or the day, it's all the same thing." "Yes, that was the last time I saw you. It was also the last day I saw Martha, except to kiss her goodbye the next morning. Post-strike, we went on to Kenya and Africa. When I got back to this country, I learned right away, of course, that McCoy had received one. But it wasn't until I flew over Orlando last week that I gave up hope. I suppose you know what happened to Orlando." Randy said, "Oh no, nobody's been that far off. It's as if no man was ever there. Even the shapes of the lakes have changed, and there are a couple of lakes that weren't there before. Find my wife? I couldn't even tell you where my house stood. I think they must have dropped a 5-megaton missile on McCoy and another on Orlando Municipal. Nothing stands. Everything is burned and still hot. It's the damn C-14 that does it." C-14? Radioactive carbon. Its half-life is more than 5,000 years. That and U-238 and cobalt and strontium is what makes rebuilding impractical in the TD, totally destroyed cities. You have to start somewhere else. Here, for instance. Did you know that you are living in the center of the largest clear area in this whole CZ? "No, I didn't, but I'm glad to find out." Helen had been waiting tensely to ask the question that she must, yet knowing the answer before she asked it, for had there been any other answer, Paul would have told her before now. She said, "Paul, nothing about Mark, I suppose." "I'm sorry, Helen, nothing. There were a few survivors from Omaha, but Mark wasn't one of them. It was a primary target with SAC headquarters. Offutt Field itself is an important base and the biggest rail complex between Chicago and the coast all grouped together. I don't think we'll ever find out exactly what happened." Helen nodded. "At least I know for sure. That's important to know." Ben Franklin stood firm, chin outthrust, taut facial muscles containing his emotions. But Peyton, eyes lowered, slipped away into the other room. Then for a long time, Paul Hart and the lieutenant radiologist questioned Randy and Sam Hazard about the way things had gone in Fort Repose, taking notes and showing remarkable interest in details of how the emergencies were met. "Of course, we need everything," Randy said, "but the town could get along fine if they only had electricity, because if they had power, then they'd have water. They wouldn't have to boil it or haul it from springs as they do now." "It'll be a long time. A very long time," Hart said. "Even major cities that weren't touched, cities in the clear zones, lost their electricity a month or so after H-Day and don't have it back yet. The only towns which have had uninterrupted power were those served by hydroelectric plants, provided the plants were undamaged and the aqueducts intact. There weren't many." "What about the other towns in the clear zones?" Randy asked. He noticed how quickly you picked up the jargon of the post-day age. It was like entering a totally new environment, like joining the army. To have light, Paul said, you either have to have water power or fuel. Most cities had supplies for a month or so. After that, darkness. Some of our big oil fields are still burning. The coal regions of Pennsylvania and West Virginia were saturated with fallout. But the transport problem is what really cripples us. Think what happened to the pipelines, the railroads, the ports. Our big hope is atomic power. Thank goodness we still have a big stockpile of nuclear fuel. The radiologist and the 2 technical sergeants excused themselves. They were going to the river to bottle water samples. Randy said that if the river was hot, they'd all be hot, because ever since the day they'd been living on the bounty of the river. Hart said that apparently the river was going to be all right, and this was hopeful. If we're going to get this CZ on the road back, I'd like to start in this area. Of course, you'll understand, Randy, that before we can be of much help to the CZs, we have to get the clear country in decent shape. He shook his head. Some of our scientists think it will take 1,000 years to restore saturated CZ, like Florida or New Jersey, to anything close to normal, even scratching the TD cities. He talked of the cities that remained, and of the shortages and the epidemics, and how fortunate they had been to live in Fort Repose. In the following year, the government was going to take a census, including the contaminated zones, if possible. There's no use kidding ourselves, he went on. We're a second-class power now. Tertiary would be more accurate. I doubt if we even have the population of France, or rather a population as large as France used to have. He talked of farm areas out of production for an indefinite period, and how the South American nations had begun lend-lease shipments to the northern continent, and how Thailand and Indonesia were contributing rice. Eventually, it was hoped that Venezuelan oil would alleviate the transport fuel shortage, although he doubted that in his lifetime he would again see gasoline for sale to private citizens. They listened, their eyes marbled as if in shock. The technicians returned from the river. Paul Hart looked at his watch and said they would have to take off. It was necessary that they drop into a small field near Brunswick, Georgia, before dark. It was presently his headquarters, but in a few years he planned to rehabilitate Patrick Air Force Base on Cape Canaveral and transfer there. The enemy had overlooked Patrick, perhaps deliberately, since it was a test and not an operational base, perhaps because the missile designed for it had gone elsewhere. They would never know. Hart was thoughtful for a moment. Then he spoke to Randy. You know, you and all of your clear people can come out if you want. Of course, you'll have to have a physical and be officially cleared and processed, but I doubt that you'll have any trouble. I'll be back here in a week. We're short on choppers, but I could bring you out 2 or 3 at a time. This was Randy's town, and these were his people, and he knew he would not leave them. Yet it was not right that he make this decision alone. He looked at Lib without finding it necessary to speak. She, knowing what was in his mind, simply smiled and winked. He said, I guess I'll stay, Paul. And the others? Randy wished Dan was with them, and yet he was confident he could speak for Dan. We have our doctor here, Dan Gunn. If it wasn't for Dan, I don't think any of us could have made it. He saved this town, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to leave now. He turned to Helen. Would he? Helen said quietly, I wouldn't, and he wouldn't. But there's one thing you have to do, Paul. Bring supplies for our doctor. What's he need? Everything. Everything that a hospital needs, but most of all, he needs a new pair of glasses. I could requisition those for him, I think, if I had his prescription. Helen said, I know where it is. Don't you dare leave, Paul. Don't you dare. She left the room and ran upstairs. What about you, Admiral Hazard? Paul asked. What about the children? What about the 2 women who live across the road, the librarian and the telegraph gal? Sam Hazard laughed. Colonel, I have a fleet under my command. If the Navy Department will give me a fleet, I'll go with you. Not otherwise. We don't have any fleets, Paul Hart said. All we've got left, really, are the nuclear submarines. The subs saved us, I guess. The subs and the solid fuel rockets and some of the airborne missiles. Lib said Alice Cooksey and Florence Wedcheck are in town, but they were talking about the possibility of going out only a few nights ago. They'll both want to stay. You see, they're terribly busy. They've never worked so hard or accomplished so much in their whole lives, and I don't know what Fort Repose would do without them. They're practically our whole education system, and they keep all the records. Isn't anybody going? Hart asked. Ben Franklin said, Not me. Peyton, who had quietly returned to the conference, said, Me either. Helen came downstairs with the prescription for Dan's glasses. They all walked out to the porch, and Randy went with Paul to the helicopter. They shook hands. Randy said, Paul, there's one more thing. Who won the war? Paul put his fists on his hips and his eyes narrowed. You're kidding. You really mean you don't know? No, I don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody's told us. We won it. We really clobbered him. Hart's eyes lowered and his arms drooped. He said, not that it matters. The engine started and Randy turned away to face the 1,000-year night.